With so much health-related information swirling around right now, it can get confusing to decide what the good information and the bad information is. And how does that information come out to the public anyway? That's what we're going to be talking about on today's Talk Shop. Hello everybody, welcome to Talk Shop. This is the place where you can learn about complex communication issues that affect our everyday lives from experts and professionals in specialized industries. As I'm filming this introduction that you're watching right now, we are in the thick of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that, of course, means that there is a ton of information out there about what we should or shouldn't be doing to protect ourselves. This info is coming at us from all angles, and it can be really difficult after a while to tease out the good information from the bad. Something that I feel is really important to understand is how good information gets created and gets disseminated to everyday people like you, like me, who might not necessarily be experts in different health fields. This interview that you are about to watch is exactly about that, how research and health-related knowledge gets translated into different forms of communication that the public can readily pick up on, and how we can protect ourselves against bad information. This interview was actually filmed a while ago, back in 2019, and I put it aside. I was looking at it and I thought, okay, you know what? I'm going to put you on the shelf for a little while because at some point there's going to be some kind of health thing that comes out that makes the discussion that you're about to watch really, really important. And here we are. Here we all are with a pandemic and a lot of bad information out there. And I figured that now would be a really good time for us to develop more understanding of how information gets shared out among the population in a reasonable way, why it can take so long for research information to get published, to be made accessible. And to help us understand this really critical aspect of health communication, I am very proud to have on the show Lauren Albrecht. Lauren Albrecht holds a PhD in educational psychology, specializing in knowledge transition, health education, and health research methods. With more than 10 years' experience as an educator and health researcher, Lauren is passionate about the intersection of knowledge translation, health patient education, and science communication. She loves research in all of its forms, but her passion is connecting the public to the research process and research evidence in meaningful ways. She has helped the public become savvier science communicators through a number of platforms, including co-producing and co-hosting Nerd Night Edmonton, producing radio podcast segments with CBC Radio, and coordinating the development of videos and ebooks regarding child health issues. So I'm happy to introduce to you Lauren Albrecht. Lauren Albrecht, welcome to this humble little show where we're trying to help people be better communicators in different aspects of work and, of course, within life. And a big area that's been in my frame of reference, and I'm sure in many other people's frame of reference right now, is health communication. You know, we're hearing about about all of the phony health stuff, all of the phony health info that comes out online on a regular basis. We're hearing about measles outbreaks all over the US and how crappy health communication is sometimes related to that. Now, you have a really specialized area in terms of health communication known as knowledge transition. Can you tell us what that is?
So the field of knowledge translation is known by a lot of different terms around the world. Some people call it knowledge translation and exchange. Some people call it implementation science. Some people call it knowledge mobilization. In Canada, we use the term knowledge translation, and the simplest definition is really the art and science of bridging the gap between what we know from research evidence and what's actually happening in the world.
Excellent. I like that you refer to it as an art. Can you tell us the art side? Because everyone thinks of the science stuff, right? Tell me what the research says. Tell me what the data is. What's the art aspect of it?
So really, people have been doing knowledge translation forever. As science has developed and health disciplines have developed their own ways of treatment and approaching patients, people have been doing knowledge translation work just intuitively. And what's been happening to catch up with that is the development of the science. So I don't want to, because it's an emerging field, I don't want to just focus on the science piece because it is really new and emergent. And there is a lot of importance to recognize the work that people have been doing intuitively, seeing that there's been a gap between what they're doing and what works in practice versus what's coming out of the research evidence as it emerges.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you've pulled out in terms of that gap and how your work might fill it?
Sure. So I think the best way of kind of framing this is thinking about how much health research evidence has exploded in the last 30, 40 years. I mean, modern medicine is still pretty young. It's still, 150 years old, and we're still learning a lot about the human body and about how to treat disease. And we've really tackled acute illness really well, and we've solved a lot of the big problems. But what we haven't been able to solve is things like chronic disease, because they're really complicated. So what we know as evidence is accumulated and more data is published every day, that there's about a 30-year lag between when something is noticed in the research evidence as a best practice or a treatment and when it actually is consistently implemented as a frontline treatment.
Oh, it's that long. I
It
wouldn't have
is that
expected
long.
30 years.
Yes.
Especially with the miracle of the internet, right? Like, can't we all just boom, put this stuff out there right away and then it magically happens? 30 years, eh?
Yeah, and part of it is the internet's young as well.
Yeah, that's true.
And ways of training clinicians and scientists have to evolve to incorporate the internet. But then once you get onto the internet, the volume of data is massive. Like it's overwhelming. So then we have a whole set of skills we have to teach people around how to find the data they need, how to evaluate its quality, how to apply it in different contexts. So there's a lot of complexity that kind of accounts for this 30-year gap. And what the field of knowledge translation is trying to do is shorten and shorten and shorten that gap so that it's in a reasonable time frame. Because as you might imagine, in 30 years, the data is most likely out of date again. So once you put it into practice, you're probably actually putting something that's out of date into practice.
Excellent. And I'm just going to take 1 second to pause this because I have to grab a Kleenex and we're going to edit out this little bit of me grabbing the Kleenex. Okay. It's freaking dry weather. I swear I'm leaking. No good. Okay. So sorry for that little pause there. Full disclosure, I needed to grab a Kleenex. I might be a little bit sniffy for the duration of this video, but I'm sure you will forgive me. After all, we are talking about health. Maybe Kleenex is one of those core markers of health as I mop up my nose. So thinking of that, shrinking down the time frame in which it takes us to bring all of this research to the public awareness and to regular practice. This is obviously a huge communication deal. And complicating it, I imagine, would be all of the misinformation that's being circulated out there. It's easy to make things that are not grounded in evidence or that aren't even grounded in any semblance of reality seem very, very valid. So in terms of public health impact and communicating to lay people, what are you, aside from just the shortening of the time frame, what sort of benchmarks do you need to achieve to make this information not just accessible, but also palatable to Joe Average like myself?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's a really complicated question too. This field of knowledge.
Tell me the answer to life in 30 seconds or less, Lauren.
I would be rich if I could do this. So essentially, the field has kind of developed a stream to look at knowledge translation to health consumers. So people that will be using the health system and making decisions about their own health or their family's health. And that's where I've been focusing my attention. It's really new. We don't have a lot of hard data about how to do this, but I think you've made a great point that we can draw from many different fields. We can draw from communications, we can draw from education, we can draw from various health disciplines that are really focused on dealing with people. So I think this is happening, but it is really new, and we're learning as we go. So one of the areas I'm really interested in is how can we maximize the power of the internet to get people trustworthy information when they need it. So when they're at home, they have a sick child, they're like, what are these symptoms? Are they serious? Do I need to see a doctor? And they're Googling, how do we get them the information they need right in that moment? And that's really tricky because it's about not only good information, but trustworthy information. How do you optimize that on things like a Google search?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need to draw in the expertise of computer scientists and lay science writers and all sorts of people, even artists, right, to create something that's visually appealing to click on. So this is sort of the challenge that we're having in this field right now.
For sure. And in terms of making the information appealing to the public, are there any particular roadblocks that you find the health translation field is running into?
Yeah, so I think it's easy when you know the research data to assume everybody understands the research data. And so we often have a block, right? For how do we actually write this? Not only in a way that's understandable, but in a way that's meaningful to someone who doesn't have the health training, the background, or who necessarily cares about all of the statistics. They just want to know, is my condition serious? Do I need to go to the hospital? Or what can I do at home to manage this? And hopefully I don't have to miss work tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. So as information consumers, how can we as the public more successfully engage with health information, with health research? Like, should we even be looking up this stuff on our own?
God.
Let's start from the real basics. Should we even be going to Google?
Yes and no. I mean, it's difficult because research, being able to understand, to consume research and to make decisions from it is a very specialized skill. It takes a lot of training. It's taken me years to understand how to read a scientific paper and make sense of the data that they're presenting and the conclusions they're drawing. Mm-hmm. So there is a certain level of expertise you need to have to be able to consume that in a useful way that's actually time effective. Mm-hmm. But we do know that people do use Google for these things. So knowing that, I think it is incumbent on health professionals and scientists to make the information that is available easy to understand, easy to access, easy to make decisions from. Mm-hmm. So I do think there is a responsibility there, and a growing awareness of that responsibility. But I mean, you can find all sorts of things on Google, and unless you know how to evaluate whether it's trustworthy, you could go down many rabbit holes. And I think we've seen this with the anti-vaxxer movement, right? Yeah. So it's a massive challenge, and I think there's lots of discussion around, Google thinking about optimizing their searches in different ways to help consumers better evaluate trustworthiness, or Facebook doing the same thing. So, I mean, I think there's lots of responsibility that lies in lots of different places, but we would be silly to tell people don't use Google because they're going to use it.
Oh yeah, like I've gone down what is this strange blemish on my skin to, oh God, I'm going to die in 2 weeks.
Exactly.
Often enough. And I come from an information from a library sciences background. I know, logically, most of us know that this is not a good information behavior, and
right.
yet we still get sucked in. So
I know.
It's so easy to get sucked in. Are there any sort of markers that that the average person out there could use in terms of saying, yes, this is a trustworthy source, or okay, maybe I shouldn't look at that so much? Are there any kind of tells?
For sure. I think the first one is to actually look at where the information is coming from, mm-hmm. and who's paying for it. So it's really important, I think, to look at information sources that are reliable. So Alberta Health Services, for example, or other organizations that you're aware of that do work that's either publicly funded or that's funded by a research body, rather than special interest groups or drug companies who have their own vested interests in the information that they provide. But sometimes that's not easy to tell right off the bat.
Yeah.
So I think it's just important to go into these types of information searches with a healthy skepticism and to ask some questions about the research that you're reading. We know that storytelling is an anecdote is really powerful. So those things are going to draw people in, and those are the techniques that everybody wants to use to share their information, whether it's trustworthy or not. So I think it's just good to make sure that you're asking questions like, where's this information coming from? Who's paying for it? What are the potential biases behind it? How does this fit with what I know about, this health condition or the health system that we're living in? Just to do some double checking.
Right, for sure. And from a higher level perspective, so for clinicians, practicing doctors, people who are in the health field industry, it's impossible to demand that every doctor is up to date on absolutely every bit of research coming out, because it's just too much for them, right? They are human beings too. And I often feel that our expectations as people who use the health system are pretty heavy in terms of what the doctors themselves can handle. So what role then does the knowledge translation come into play in terms of the practicing clinician? How
Great
much do
question.
they need to rely on you, basically? Or how
Yeah.
much should they be relying on you?
So I think the first thing is there are a lot of systems in place now to help doctors, so they don't have to have all this information in their head. So
Mm-hmm.
the first thing I think patients should be aware of is do not be offended or question your doctor if they need to actually go to their computer and look up what exactly like your symptoms are, what it could possibly be, because those are the tools that are helping them hold all this information and all this data in their minds, and they just want to be sure that they're presenting you with a comprehensive picture of the most accurate data. So I think that's one thing. Patients can sometimes feel offended or like maybe their doctor isn't an expert if they can't just fire off the information. But like you said, there's just so much volume and it is changing really rapidly. So there are tools that doctors use that are more sophisticated than Google, but they kind of look like Google.
What?
To help them keep a hold of all the information that they're going to need to be effective practitioners. And in terms of what knowledge translation scientists do, one of the things that we focus on doing is synthesizing research evidence. So really physicians and other clinicians should not be making decisions based on one research study. They should be taking a number of research studies and synthesizing that data together across contexts, geographies, countries, and looking at the picture of that illness or that treatment at a much higher level.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is one thing that we focus a lot on in knowledge translation science, is synthesizing that data so that we can get a bigger picture rather than just relying on one study from one place. And then what we need to do with that information is effectively communicate that in terms of one-page summaries or practice recommendations, and get that out to health practitioners through their regulatory bodies or their professional associations so that they have a quick reference guide of like a bird's eye view of the data.
Right. Right. So you become kind of the intermediary, saying, okay, we've gone through it. This is good stuff. Here's the stuff you need so that you don't need to spend all of your time looking into it.
Exactly. And where the data is not good, because there's many areas that are understudied, underfunded, just because they're not priorities at the moment. We need to tell them that. We need to say, look, this is the data that exists. Here's the quality of that data. Here's how that should affect your decision making. Because we're not telling physicians what to do. We're just giving them this information so that they can then use that in conjunction with their professional judgment, right?
For sure. Now, you are, just to change tracks slightly, you are a self-avowed nerd.
Yes.
I bow to you. I definitely consider myself in the same camp as well. I'm wondering where you see within nerd culture, where are the useful intersections between nerd culture, and I don't just mean, the super cerebral stuff, the fun stuff too, but those intersections between nerd culture and the research and knowledge translation, how do they blend?
I think it is a really great fit. I think the reason I was attracted to knowledge translation is very similar to the reason I love doing Nerd Night Edmonton.
Mm-hmm.
It's about curiosity and going down various rabbit holes to see, what does the evidence actually say? What can we do with this evidence? And it's about healthy skepticism, challenging the norm, trying to see if there are better new ways to do things. So to me, it's actually a really natural fit.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you mentioned Nerd Night. We're going to bring it up for all of you out there. If there is probably a Nerd Night in or near wherever it is you live, it's all over North America. It's weirdly popular in Germany. Check it out. I'll put a link down below for sure. It's a very, very good time. You can learn a lot of stuff there. If you look at events like Nerd Night, which again, to give our audience some context, it's a speaker event, 20-minute talks plus 10-minute Q&As afterwards. There's a lot of opportunity for really gleeful exchange of very high level information in an accessible and an interesting way. These are people who are deeply passionate about their topics and who want to share them with anyone who's interested. So you are a Nerd Night boss here in Edmonton, and I'm wondering, from your perspective, to what degree are people who are involved in these kinds of events or who have platforms online, like maybe they are moderators of online forums, or they run an online community, or have a really influential blog or something like that, to what degree should they be involved in the dissemination and the policing or the verifying of the information that's being shared through their events or through their forums or through their platforms? What responsibility do we who actually disseminate information have?
Oh, that's a really good question, and
Because
a
it's got to be
really
tricky. Like, you're not an expert on everything that happens at Nerd Night either. It's impossible. It's all different disciplines. So what do you do?
right. I do think we do have responsibility. I think it's important that when you're running an event, just like when you're publishing a paper, that you're putting out the best information possible for people to use in ways that are meaningful for them. So I do think people who run these events have to think about that and have to kind of wrestle with that challenge. I think the way you can do it, and the way we've tried to approach it at Nerd Night, is to work with speakers beforehand. So it's not just a matter of saying, "Hi, I want to speak," and then we put you up on stage. There's a process to talk about what you want to talk about, what are your key messages, how can we make that the most meaningful in 20 minutes for our audience, and also to just make sure that people aren't pushing their own agenda that might be in conflict with the open-mindedness, the inclusivity, and the research-based focus we want to have at Nerd Night. So I think, we can run into challenges for people who have strong opinions in certain areas, whether they be health or something else, politics. And we can also run into challenges when it comes to businesses, right? And people wanting to promote their business. So there is a fine line, and we're just trying to be really honest about that and vet people so that when they're up on stage, they're aware of those nuances and providing a meaningful message.
That's a big task and a pretty big responsibility. How do you personally keep any of your own existing biases out of those decisions, or how do you try to minimize it so that you know that you're coming at this from an objective angle yourself? Because we all have our beliefs, our ideologies, our biases. How do you pull yourself out of that and look at things objectively?
That is tough, and I
Yeah.
think I'm one of those unique scientists that don't really believe in complete objectivity. And I think it's because I come from a qualitative research background. The world is full of biases. We as people are full of biases, and it's totally impossible to keep something bias free.
Mm-hmm.
I think the key is to acknowledge your bias, to work with a team of people you trust, to accept feedback from your audience or the stakeholders in your work, and to just keep it an open and reflexive conversation. And I think that's the way you don't necessarily eliminate bias, but you make bias a topic of conversation. And it can shift and grow as your work shifts, as your event grows. So yeah, it's not really about eliminating it. It's just about being aware of it and keeping it front of mind, and challenging yourself in your decisions, asking questions, and taking feedback.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that acknowledging that it is there, I think, is one of the biggest ways to overcome the problems that can be created from it. Because like you said, it's impossible to do anything without some kind of bias or context coloring the way that you look at the information that's in front of you. So if you say, okay, I know that I'm probably going to be affected by this, then the threat of it kind of goes down a little bit. It's like you look the
Exactly.
devil in the eye.
Yeah, exactly.
You're here. Let's do this. So if you were to give some words of wisdom to all of us out there trying to navigate the glut of information we have in terms of health, in terms of wellness that's out there, what would be the top piece of advice that you would have for people who are wanting to find high quality health information and who also really want to understand what they're seeing and what they're reading?
Right. Yeah, I think the first thing is to trust your expertise, but also trust where you're not an expert. Acknowledge where you're not an expert.
Mm-hmm.
And once you kind of know where that lies, you can then approach a question you have, knowing where your strengths are and where your weaknesses are. So, for example, you come from a library information background. You, I'm sure, are great at finding information, but maybe it's on a topic that you're not familiar with. So you know you're strong in finding the information. Maybe you need to pull in some expertise to evaluate that information,
Mm-hmm.
or to make sure that it's what you need to make a decision with. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is to really think about who you trust. Do you
Mm-hmm.
trust your doctor? Do you trust another health professional? Do you trust a certain organization and the information they put forward? And kind of make your list of go-to sources. And I think the third thing is to ask questions. Don't feel shy. There is a lot of information out there, and it's really hard to know what it means or what to do with it or how it sits in the larger body of research. So asking questions is the way that you figure that out and the way you build capacity. And it's also the way that you can build that expertise around you. So you know the next time you have a question, you know who to go to find the answer.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's I can't give you a concrete list of you should do these 5 things and you'll always
Of
know
course
if you
not.
should go to the hospital or not. But I mean, I think it's a lot about reflection and kind of knowing what you know, what you don't know, and where you can go to fill those gaps.
Right. And that's a really, really solid piece of advice. Especially I like the notion of coming up with the list of who you trust, but also asking those questions. Okay, why do I think this way? What's informing this decision? Because then you can figure out maybe where your trust is being pulled in different directions. It's that
Exactly.
yeah, it's that big engagement with your information piece and asking why all the time. Endless
Exactly.
whys, and then we never come up with any solid answers.
It's like we're all 2 years old and
Yes.
we're asking why all the time.
Well, I am so appreciative of you coming on and telling us about this whole world, because I don't know many people who have ever heard of knowledge translation, but it really does affect our ability to communicate and engage with health information. And with all of the misinformation that's out there, I think this is a critical area of scholarly engagement that the average person in the public should at least know exists, because maybe then we're a little more understanding of why things take time, of why evidence isn't necessarily 100% certain the minute that it hits the ground, why maybe we shouldn't trust that thing we saw on Facebook. I mean, that's an easy example. That's like shooting a fish in a barrel. Uh, but I am really appreciative of you coming on and sharing a little piece of your world with the audience out here. So if we want to know more about this, the $1,000,000 question, where can we find more of you and your work? Like nerd related, research related, where can we engage with you?
For sure. You can check out my website,
Yes.
laurenalbrecht.ca. You can check out Nerd Night Edmonton at edmonton.nerdnight.com. And we spell night N-I-T-E. And you can actually look up, if you Google knowledge translation, there's quite a number of knowledge translation organizations in Canada. And Canada is really at the forefront of this research. And that will give you a really good sense of who's doing this work and where. The University of Alberta has very robust research in this area, but so do a number of institutions across the country. And we are working on solutions for these big problems. But yeah, they're complicated and they involve human behavior, so it's going to take time. But if you do ever come across a research study looking for participants to help us in this endeavor, please sign up, because that is how we advance the science. We need the participation of health consumers and health professionals to get the data to understand what works for whom, in what context, and why.
Yeah, area where, you know, all of us out there like me who really doesn't know anything about this world, we can help out by providing our own information there as well. So on that note, let's wrap it up. Thank you so much for being here, Lauren. Of course, for everyone out there who is watching, if you would like more great interviews on different areas of communication that affect our work and that affect our life, make sure that you click subscribe on this channel, hit that notification bell, and head over to laurensergi.com to sign up for the newsletter so that you don't miss any future interviews or other goodies that I will send your way. Again, Lauren, thank you for being here with us. To all of you who have been watching, thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you on the next Talk Shop interviews. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Lauren.